Welcome to episode 4 of the Monday Night Review. I have waited and waited all day to record this episode. An alarm went off in the flats behind my house for about 2 hours. And then it was time for me to go and get my kids from school. And now this sounds like every kid in the borough is now playing in the park opposite. And for some reason, the tube has started hooting its horn. So the background noise could be phenomenal in this, but hopefully not. It's also stinkingly hot, and I broke my wrist at the weekend. So I'm sitting here in my undies with a plaster cast on, feeling very grumpy and sorry for myself. So I'm hoping that a good old-fashioned ghost story is going to cheer me right up. And I hope it cheers you up too. This is one of my favourite ghost stories, and it could go on for hours. It's not going to. It's going to be a short quickie, but there's actually loads that you can read up on about it once you've dug far enough in. So today I'm going to tell you about Hinton Ampner. This place I've been fascinated with since I can remember. Yes, it's in Hampshire, just down the road from where I grew up, but that's not how it started. It started with Borley Rectory, which is where every English preteen starts when they want to freak themselves out reading about haunted houses. And when I was doing that, I saw this familiar name, Hinton Ampner, come up. And that was more tangible. That was 10 minutes down the road from my childhood home. And I was just hooked. It doesn't hurt that I love houses, and this is, as it is now, near as damn it, my perfect house, except for the haunting. And so I'm not sure, even though technically the house that stands there now is different to the house we're going to talk about today, I'm not sure I could even live there now because of the haunting stories. So Hinton Ampner is in the village, near the village of Bramdean, in pretty much central Hampshire, I'd say. So the south of England. The Isle of Wight is technically in Hampshire, for those of you not up on your English geography. It's right down the bottom, below London and Surrey, and it's where I grew up, and it's beautiful. I am biased, of course, but I do think it is beautiful. And go and look at Hinton Ampner now. It's absolutely stunning. On first appearances, it is just another exceptionally beautiful National Trust property. It's well positioned, beautiful land, great shop. The National Trust chocolate honeycomb is my favourite. And if you Google it, you don't even have anything, you can't find anything about it being terrifyingly and extremely haunted until about page 3 of Google. So hopefully that will change with this podcast. But I think part of that's down to the fact that the current house is not actually the manor in question. The original house is nearer the church. So at the moment, if you go to Hinton Ampner, you drive up this beautiful driveway through fields. There's often livestock in the fields, and you go through sort of the shop is in the old stables. You go through the shop, past the old stables and the old workshops and things, and then there's the beautiful house. And to the left of the house is the church, and next to that is an orchard, and that's where the original house was. So the original house was nearer the church, about 50 yards from where the house now stands, north facing and in a traditional E shape. There's an orchard in its place now, though some of the fruit trees are difficult to grow there because their roots get stopped by the original foundations. Some Tudor parts remain, the stables, which are now the cafe, and some of the trees date back to 1720. It's in a much better position now, I think. It's got such a stunning view. It's also a note to keen bean gardeners that the garden is stunning, really lovely. The house you visit now is built in 1930s. My dream era. So it's a beautiful 1930s house. The last owner, Rafe Dutton, was a lover of culture, lunch parties, Italian art and gardens. He wrote a book about the house, the new one he built, which only mentions the hauntings in a rather vague way. He mentions something about his mother being carried from the old house in the middle of the night as a baby because the hauntings had got too much for the lady of the house to bear, so she just fled the house in the middle of the night. The house as it stands now in its faded 30s glory looks inviting and warm and welcoming. And it's, as I said, it's got this beautiful view out over the Hampshire rolling countryside and these lovely curated gardens. The original house was thought to be cold and draughty, protected from storms by trees, and it accessed up a steep lane that's not easily accessible. And it's the driveway stays this beautiful sweeping driveway, and it was hard to access originally, and it must have felt really dark and dreary and lonely. But why is this story so fascinating in particular? Well, it's the consistency of the witness statements for me, and the fact that the witnesses are varied in social standing and who they were. There's a future First Lord of the Admiralty, for example, is one of them. And rumour has it the story is possibly the basis for one of my favourite books, which is The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. If you haven't read it, read it now. I mean, ideally you'd read it in the autumn when it was dark in the evenings and not blazing sunlight, but it's such a good book. And it's one of the few books of fiction, I have to say, that scares me pretty much every time I read it. So, first things first, what any haunted house needs is some good old-fashioned on-site death, and this house had its fair share. The original house had been, now, I'm not good on surnames, and Stukely family at the end of the 16th century. So it's been in the Stukely family. By the end of the 18th century, it belonged to Edward Lord Stawell, who'd married Mary Stukely, who in today's terms would no doubt be thought of as a cougar because she was 10 years older than him. She died and he moved on to her younger sister, Honoria, and they allegedly had a child that mysteriously disappeared soon after it was born. Lord Stawell was by all accounts a bit of an evil liver, and when his mistress died, Honoria, it was thought worthy karmic distribution for his ill living, and he himself died of a sudden fit of apoplexy in the parlour, which I think sounds like something from a Noel Coward song. And again, this was just deemed to be just reward for his terrible behaviour. So the Stawells inherited the house through Mary Stukely in 1719. They mostly used the house as a hunting lodge, and when the next Lord Stawell died, his young wife, who'd had an unhappy childhood there, decided to let it out. So enter Mr. and Mrs. Ricketts and their one baby at the time. He would be in Jamaica a lot. She was deemed a woman of great sense and remarkable vigour, both physical and mental. She sounds amazing. Before they even arrived to the house, it had a reputation for being haunted, strange noises and sightings, but when the Ricketts arrived, things really started happening. Doors were slammed in the night, all at the same time, and loud enough to wake the whole house. Footsteps rushed about in the downstairs room. The pets would suddenly slink away and hide, only to return minutes later completely unfussed. So they'd be Mrs. Ricketts' favourite cat would be sitting on a chair and then would jump and hide behind her legs and stare out at something without moving, and then 2 minutes later would just jump back onto its chair again. When this first started happening, Mr. Ricketts had the locks changed to ensure it wasn't a prank being played by local youth, having got hold of a set of keys, but the noises continued. So one of the first sightings was the baby's nanny saw a man go into a room, only to follow him in, and there was no one there. Another visitor witnessed a man in a drab suit, as this spectre became known, assumed it was the butler, and then was surprised to find that the butler was already gone to bed, and actually somebody went to check, and the butler was indeed in bed. So the man in a drab suit had actually been sighted before by someone who worked there, but it was written off as, it was one of the servants. It was just written off as either a lie or them being mistaken. But now there's been 2 sightings of the man in the drab suit. A woman in a dark silk dress was heard to come down the kitchen stairs and walk into the kitchen. She was seen by 4 people, and then she vanished on the arrival of the cook, came through the kitchen door, and the apparition just disappeared. And she saw it disappear. So that's 5 people who saw this woman. The apparitions always seem to be in a hurry, rushing into the kitchen or across the hall, and it's usually the lady in the dark silk dress that's seen and the man in the drab suit. Mrs. Ricketts was often awoken by the sound of rustling silk, which was the sound accompanying the lady in the dark dress, and she often heard this going along the corridor outside her room, or even coming up to her bed as if someone was approaching her bed. In 1769, Mr. Ricketts left his family to go and look after some business in Jamaica. So imagine 1769, it's going to take months by boat to even get to Jamaica. So Mary Ricketts knows she's going to be home alone for some time. And it's now that things go from bad to worse. Mary stayed at home with 6 servants and her now 3 children. And she moved from her usual bedroom to a room nearer her children. And she was frequently woken up by noises outside and inside her room. The sounds never woke her kids, and throughout all the hauntings in the house, no one under the age of 18 is ever affected. They never get woken up by any of the noises, they never see anything. So if you look into poltergeists and that sort of thing, people often believe that they stem from the energy of one particular person, and quite often that is a child. I think it was believed that one of her children did sort of tremble in the night, but no one, as I said, was ever woken up or anything like that. Mrs. Ricketts used to hear men's footsteps approaching her bed and a rustle of skirts. She would hear a disembodied female voice that was then joined by 2 male voices, starting as a gentle whisper and getting louder. And one by one the servants left, but Mary stood her ground, and though often terrified, she would return to her bedroom even when so convinced a man was walking up to her bed that she'd fled terrified. There would be knocking so loud on the front door it sounded like someone was trying to forcibly break in through the wooden door, and when the door was checked, it had no mark on it, and it would be checked by the whole household standing in the hallway because everyone would have woken up. That's how loud it was. So then there was the murmuring, which started at the beginning of 1770, the sounds of lots of people talking at once. I've experienced this in the house where I grew up, and it's really strange. And my mum put it really well because she described it as we had an arts and crafts house where the bedrooms were off a landing and it was an open hallway. And she described it to me once as people leaving a dinner party and not wanting to wake you up. So they're not talking about you, which did sort of make me feel better. So the night walking increased. Mrs. Ricketts now heard the footsteps of multiple people, and searching for an intruder with her maid, they both watched a door just open and close over and over and over again while they sat in the room. The murmuring grew louder and more intense. Mary now slept with a servant in her room and basically couldn't sleep for more than an hour at a time because it was so loud. It's not even that she was scared, it was that it was just too loud for her to be able to sleep. The straw that broke the camel's back was a night when a huge crash woke up Mary, the servant in her room, and the nursery maid, and they all lay in their beds and listened to a shrill and dreadful shriek as it repeated, growing fainter and fainter until it disappeared seemingly through the floor of the hallway. After hearing this, the nursery maid actually couldn't move or speak for 2 hours. She was so terrified. It's after this that Mary's brother, John Jarvis, comes to stay and is shocked by her appearance. He finally gets her to tell him what's been happening, and he and a neighbour decide to stay up all night and catch the imposter red-handed. He refuses to believe that it's not someone up to naughtiness in the house, and together with John's butler, they search the house thoroughly. They check every room, all the servants' quarters, all the cupboards, everywhere that anything could be hidden or anyone could hide. And then they sat up in wait to see what would happen. So every room in the house was occupied, and the neighbour and the butler took the first watch and were ready to wake John up should anything happen, and they were not disappointed. Grunts and groans and the sound of rustling silk happened almost immediately, and the men rushed upstairs to where it seemed to be coming from, and nothing was there. So after this night, the neighbour declared the house unfit for human inhabitants. I've written, no shit. But Jarvis stayed on to get to the bottom of the haunting, staying up all night and sleeping during the day. He still believed that there was a rational solution for all the goings on. But that changed when he was woken by a loud crash, sounding like a large piece of furniture falling through the ceiling onto the floor. No one else heard the noise, and Jarvis wrote to Mary's husband to tell him that the house was not habitable. And he said, and it should be noted that Mary's a complete badass and described by her brother as harassed but not terrified, and the children are completely unaffected. So after this, they were released from their rental contract. Lady Hillsborough, as she now was, being fully aware of the situation in the house, John Jarvis had tried to contact her secretary to get him to spend a night with them to hear the noises, and he'd been ill and had sent his 15-year-old assistant, and the men had deemed it too upsetting for the 15-year-old to witness, so they sent him away again. Rewards were offered for anyone to shed light on a plot to create the noises in the house, but no one came forward despite it being quite a lot of money offered. Mary moved the children out first and remained, staying with friends nearby to oversee the packing up of the house. And while she was there, Mary experienced a haunting that terrified her so badly she didn't really speak of it, and it stayed with her into old age. But luckily, she wrote about it in a journal kept for her children, so we have some details of it. Basically, an old dishonest steward who died years before appeared at a window and called for Richard Cammy, who was the friend she was staying with locally. And this happened 3 times, and the man at the window seemed quite distressed, and it was just a horrible apparition. The Cammy family kept an eye on the house for the remainder of the lease once Mary finally left, and all experienced groaning, crashing noises, and family members walking past heard such loud noises whilst the house stood empty that they climbed in through an open window to apprehend burglars, but no one was in the house. They were actually the 2 oldest Ricketts sons who had grown up there, and they happened to be walking past their old house, and they heard these noises and climbed in through a kitchen window to try and catch the burglars. The Lawrences were the next inhabitants, and they lasted barely a year before they left lock, stock and barrel in the middle of the night with no warning. In 1793, the new owner pulled the house down and built a new one nearby, where the house now stands, but no one wanted to live in it. During the demolition, 2 boxes were discovered under the floorboards, one containing lots of papers and one containing what was believed to be the skull of a baby, though it looked rather ape-like. So it was believed that this could have been the illegitimate child of Lord Stawell and his unmarried sister-in-law, Honoria, and it no doubt died a natural death and was probably, sadly, very deformed when it was born, but it didn't help the house's reputation. And it seems weird to not just sort of bury it quietly in the churchyard next door rather than putting it under the floorboard. And where's the rest of the body? So this could all have been dismissed as hearsay and rumour, except Mary Ricketts documented it for all her children. She put a stipulation on there that no one was to read it under the age of 18, and unless they had a strong constitution. And there was correspondence between her and her husband, her brother and her husband, and her brother was actually furious for the rest of his life that he wasn't able to get to the bottom of what was going on at Hinton Ampner. To go there now is to see it, where it all is for merely geographical purposes. The current house itself was devastated by fire and then rebuilt, and is a joy to visit if you love the 30s and 40s style. It's got sort of a really old school 30s bathroom. It's just beautiful. But as far as we know, no hauntings have happened there. Is there a haunted house that fascinates you? For me, I just could go to Hinton Ampner again and again and again, and I've read up as much as I can. Some of my sources were haunted-britain.com, spookyisles.com, A Natural History of Ghosts by Roger Clark, which is a great book, and Poltergeist by Sir Cheverell Sitwell, which is quite a hefty read, but the Hinton Ampner bit's really good because it's just their correspondence and stuff, so it's all from then. But I really, if you like haunted stories, then A Natural History of Ghosts is great by Roger Clark. And I will speak to you next week. Let me know if there's a haunted house that fascinates you. And until then, stay safe, be kind, and always check the back seat before you drive.